So those in the room were like, well, I don't doing my PhD. I'm not as smart as the rest of the people. No, no, no. If you're not doing your PhD, you're smarter than people who are doing their PhD, okay? I mean, there's the only data I know about correlation between incomes and education is that the positive relationship stop at the master level. If you do your PhD, you're not going to make more money, so it doesn't mean anything. So my name is Francois Lachapelle. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology at UBC. My dissertation work focused on mapping global network of PhD exchange between more than 1,000 research universities across the globe, both in science, humanity, and social sciences. So the Relational Academia project came when me and my colleague had a very simple question we wanted to answer in 2011, which is, who gets the job as university professor in Canada? Apart from being super smart, like as we just said, is there any other specific characteristic in terms of race, ethnicity, educational trajectory, publication record that can explain who gets the job? So very few scholars, in fact, we are some of the only scholars in Canada who try to answer this question systematically and empirically. So answer this question about university professor. Tonight I'll focus especially on from which country Canadian university professor received their PhD. But to answer all these different questions we had, we built what is the largest data set on the topic. We collect data on more than 5,000 university professors working at U15 school between 1977 and 2017. U15 stands for the top 15 research university in Canada. And for this first project, we focused mostly on social sciences. Now we're expanding. But you might be, Francois, why are you studying? You're studying where university professors are studying. Who's your advisor? I'm going to call this guy. He's a moron. In fact, I feel very good about that topic. And I think that with the comprehensive data we have, we're going to be able to inform educational policy, the trajectory of people, don't do your PhD. And also, we're going to help reshape narrative about PhD in Canada. Because I think that higher education is at a crossroad, like Dr. Porter said. We have more PhD than ever in Canada. We never had the lowest proportion of PhD who become university professor. And research is telling us that the PhD still want to become university professor. I think we need some research. And the second reason why I think it's an important topic is that professors offer us a window through which we can look at the history of higher education and science very intimately. And I think there's an even better reason. It can help us going beyond this powerful idea of science and academic space as a quiet and orderly space for reflection and discovery, or the best, the bright of the brightest rays at the top. I'm informed by the sociology of science. It's a tradition that looked at the academic field in science like any other space in society. There's conflict, there's power struggle, and there's powerful dynamic of exclusion. And it's especially true since my data start looking at this question of who makes it all the way to the 1960s in Canada. And we know that this time in Canada was a time of explosive and a time of very strong political movement, right? There's actually two, if we think about the 1960s and 70s in Canada, we will probably think about two main things that all of us know about the history of Canada, social history in Canada. The first thing is that it's recognized as a time of emancipation and progressive political movement. Feminist movement, there's a civil rights movement in the United States, there's a minority movement, and the anti-war movement, right? So the second thing is that it's also recognized as a time of growing Canadian nationalism. The second thing is that it's a time where the baby boomer would say, we want to go to university. So they enter massively university. So it created a demand for a university professor and instructor. Well, the Canadian university could not really supply these professors. So they hired American and British, massively. So again, we're in a time where the Canadian Anglo-nationalism is growing. So Canadian intellectuals are saying two things. Well, our student or young mind are being taught with US textbooks and material? And secondly, if American professors are teaching in Canada, well, are they only hiring their buddy from back home? And the Canadian professor or scholar are excluded from to be professor in Canada. So this brought about the rise of the Canadianization movement. It's a movement with two clear goals in mind: to increase the number of Canadian textbooks, lecture for Canadian students, and the second thing, to increase the proportion of Canadian-born, land immigrant, and Canadian-trained professor in Canada. Make a lot of sense. So the historical narrative looks something like that, where a professor did their PhD. 1960s, 70s, the Americanization. Then we have the Canadianization up until the early year 2000. And then more recently, the scholars are obsessed with it's the re-Americanization, but nobody ever really tests these things. So with my data tonight, I will just look at the Canadianization movement, did it really happen, and the re-Americanization. So we can see the red line is growing between 1977 and 97, which is an increase in the proportion of U15 professors who did their PhD in Canada. And the blue line is the proportion of American trained, which is going down, which is consistent with the Canadianization argument. And they are about the same level in 97. What happened afterwards? Well, afterward, things start to change a lot. The proportion of professors who are training in Canada is actually stalling. And for the first time in more than 40 years, it's going down a little bit. For the blue one, there's no re-Americanization per se, but there's clearly a stall in the de-Americanization. That's what we can say. So when we look at this data, it's pretty consistent with what the literature is saying. But if we look at Canada top 3 university, UBC, McGill, and University of Toronto, well, the story is completely different because the literature is telling us that these 3 universities, compared to the rest of the field, they are very different in terms of hiring, prestige, resources, and global outlook. So let's look at the result. So we can see that there was no significant Canadianization here. As max at 27% in 2007, and ever since then it's been going down. If we look at the de-Americanization, well, it really didn't never happen. The lowest point is 61%, and it's been going up since. So the claim of re-Americanization seemed to work for here. So how can we explain all these things, right? The de-Americanization, the stall of this. Well, the literature suggests at least one thing. It's called the internationalization of higher education, which means that it's a very powerful force that rendered previous model of what it means to be a good university, which in the past it was, well, we need a Canadian university, Canadian content. And these days it's a global outlook, a global university, with the American university at the very center of this model. So I hope that my talk helped you think differently about professor, and that can be cool studying professor, right? And higher education and science, because this is at the very center of the spirit of the PSI initiative, to start thinking about doctoral education differently. So thank you very much.